This video is brought to you by Loot Crate. Head today to lootcrate.com/reviewtechusa and enter the code RTU to save 10% on any subscription plan. Skip it up and that up. So as many of you know, I talked about it in my original new 3DS video. Xenoblade Chronicles is going to be only compatible with the new 3DS because it has more buttons that are required for the game and because the new 3DS has a faster CPU. Now, I gave my take on the whole new 3DS thing and how I'm very, at best, lukewarm on it. And a lot of the defense I heard for people defending Nintendo was, well, Rich, Apple comes out with a new iPod every year. Why is it, when other companies do things like this, you don't jump on them? But I'll say back before I go into my whole history of Nintendo and portable consoles is that the iPod and iPhone are multimedia devices. When you buy a 3DS, when you buy a PS4, when you buy an Xbox One, Xbox 360, PS3, etc., you're buying a dedicated gaming console. And the nice thing about buying a dedicated gaming console, and the reason people do this, is because the luxury of owning one of those devices is that you're going to at least get 5 years out of it, usually. So has Nintendo done something like this in the past before where they cut, even if their console was selling well, where they cut one of their portable consoles, the lifespan of it short? And they kind of have. Let me go into the history of the Game Boy and the DS here, and then I'll give you my thoughts on it afterwards. Now, these are release dates for the Nintendo portable consoles in the States, so it may be different if you're from Europe, if you're from Asia. They may have released at different times. I'm going by stateside release dates of Nintendo portable consoles here. So let's start off with good old 1989. Yep, 1989. The original brick white Game Boy came out. And that Game Boy, the original Game Boy was relevant until 1998, okay? Yeah, there were other iterations. There was the Game Boy Pocket. They came out with different color Game Boys. There was a backlit Game Boy in Japan, I believe it was, that wasn't in the States. Why, I don't know. That would have been brilliant because the screen, you had to get all these different peripherals to put on the screen of the original Game Boy so you could see it in the dark. But point being is that the original game, it doesn't matter, even though they came out with different Game Boys, if you had an original Game Boy from 1989, you could play all the games that came out for the Game Boy until they came out with the only thing it wasn't compatible with was the Game Boy Color game. So if you got a Game Boy game in 1997 and you bought your Game Boy in 1989 and it was still working, you could play any game for the Game Boy that was out there. So it almost had a decade-long run as being the original Game Boy was Nintendo's relevant console for almost a decade, okay? Then they did something, if you look back at it, even though it sold relatively well, they came out in 1998, they came out with the Game Boy Color. And if you read up why they did it, it was because developers were saying, hey, the Game Boy is getting, the format, the hardware is getting long in the tooth, and it's black and white. We need more CPU power. We need color. So I think because they were getting pressure from devs and third-party devs, they came out with the Game Boy Color. And what was weird was in 2001, they came out with the Game Boy Advance. So the Game Boy Color was only Nintendo's lead platform for 3 years. Looking back at that, though, like I just said, I think Nintendo did it to probably appease shareholders because they were getting pressure from third-party devs. That was the reason why the Game Boy Color existed. And honestly, it was pretty ridiculous if you think about it, especially for the 3 extra years. I know people are going to disagree with this. I think Nintendo should have held off, just held with the original Game Boy. And because people were pissed off at that, they got the Game Boy Color. And in 2001, the Game Boy Advance came out. And then Nintendo kind of did it again. The Game Boy Advance was their most relevant platform only until 2004 when Nintendo dropped the DS. Now, here's the thing that's interesting about the DS, because Nintendo almost went back to what they did with the Game Boy. Not as long of a life, not almost a decade, but a hell of a lot longer than what they did with the Color Game Boy and the Advanced Game Boy. The DS, yes, there was the DSi. Yes, there was the DS Lite. There was the DSi XL and all that other crap. The DS was Nintendo's relevant. If you had the original ugly-ass DS, you could still play all the games that you could play in the DSi, minus they had like that DSi shop. I could be calling it the wrong thing, but I know there are games you could download for that you couldn't play on the original DS because they didn't have the, I guess you could call it the App Store like the DSi had. But all the cartridge games, for if you had the original DS, all the cartridge games could play on the original DS. So if you had a cartridge game for the DSi, it would work on the original DS. So from 2004 to 2011, 7 years, the DS had a shelf life. The original DS had a shelf life of 7 years. There was no other format out there. So you got over half a decade out of your DS if your original one was still working, until they came out with the 3DS in 2011. And now we know what's going on. Probably in 2015 in the States, we're going to get a newer 3DS. So 3 years and change is the shelf life of the original 3DS. So Nintendo has kind of done this before, but then they kind of went back and forth. Almost a decade with the original Game Boy. 7 years with the DS. I mean, they had those little hiccups with the Advance and the Color, but they kind of have done it in the past and they haven't. What concerns me now, though, and you would think that Nintendo would think about this, is that they would understand that a person who buys a dedicated console, the reason I like dedicated consoles, even with my damn gaming PCs, is you know that you're going to at least get 5 years out of it, where you don't have to worry about getting a new console, where you don't have to worry about upgrading hardware. It's a luxury. And yes, I know they've done it in the past before with the Color and Advance Game Boys, but I don't think they should have repeated that, because people look like, oh, you know, the Game Boy, if I buy a 3DS, listen to me, I know that Nintendo's probably going to support it until like 2016, 2017, so I'll get a few more years out of it. And now that they're doing this, yes, I don't care what you say, it's a slap in the face to the 40 plus million other 3DS owners out there, especially ones who may have just invested in the console thinking, hey, Nintendo just released this in 2011. It probably still has like 2.5, 3 more years to it. No, it doesn't. It has only a few more months, and then if you want to play games like Xenoblade Chronicles, you're going to have to buy the new 3DS console. And yeah, it's a slap in the face to fans of Nintendo and consumers of Nintendo, no matter what anybody says. Alright folks, this is Rich of Review Tech USA. Make sure to rate, comment, favorite, and subscribe. And as always, thank you for supporting my channel. Have a good one. The preceding video was brought to you by Big Cheese's YouTube channel. For gameplay reviews, gaming music, and vlogs, subscribe to Big Cheese VG. Link below in the description.